School is in. But are you really ready to learn? Open your eyes to a new day in education with the Awakening Educator, a program specifically designed to explore a new, mindful way of educating our youth. Learn about social-emotional learning, new modalities of teaching, and the most relevant topics in education with your hosts, Susan Andrian and Megan Sweet. Susan and Megan will take you inside the issues by looking at them from different points of view, from policies and research to teaching models that are actually used in schools. There's never a dull moment in this classroom. Have any questions you'd like to ask? Maybe you have knowledge you'd like to share, and share your thoughts live on air. Grab a pen and paper and get ready to open your textbooks and minds to a new way of learning on the Awakening Educator.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Awakening Educator. My name is Megan Sweet.
And I'm Susan Andrian.
We're really excited to have you all here today. We are in part 2 of our series on equity, and today we're speaking with Leroy Gaines, who became a teacher out of college and saw firsthand the power of teaching and the power of educators to impact children's lives. After 4 years, Leroy joined Partners in School Innovation, where I actually also worked, but we missed each other like ships in the night. And that organization really works on data and learning how to use data to focus on student achievement. And then he finally came to Oakland Unified and became an elementary school principal at a school called Acorn Woodland. And he was there for 9 years, so a very seasoned school principal. As a principal and finally as a mentor principal and working with other OUSD leaders, Oakland Unified leaders as an executive principal, Leroy was able to understand the massive challenges facing Oakland Unified School District and the opportunities to creatively and strategically address those challenges. And you can imagine how that impacts every school across the country. He was recognized as Principal of the Year in Oakland, and his school was named a California Distinguished School by the California Department of Education. And one of Leroy's proudest moments was being one of 2 California leaders ever recognized by the Human Rights Campaign for his work in facilitating an inclusive learning community for children, ensuring that LGBTQ+ youth felt safe and connected. And now Leroy leads an organization that recruits, trains, and retains quality principals across the country. So much more to be said about you, Leroy, but welcome to the Awakening Educator. We're so excited to have you here.
Oh, thank you. I'm super excited to be here. I was going through and trying to figure out how to link this onto my Facebook because I was like, everyone needs to know about this. Like, needs to know about what you're doing and about the conversations that are happening. I think a lot of educators aren't aware of what of these conversations, and we need to do more of this. And also, I don't like to hear about things that I've accomplished. I was like, so someone saying good, nice things about me. It's rare, as an educator, you're just sort of like, no, I'm just doing my job. So, but I do appreciate those kind words.
I have to say, as someone who is around the district, it's actually not that rare that people are saying nice things about you. You may not hear them all the time, but I hear lots of nice things about you around the district.
It's true. You've managed to be a highly successful and well-liked principal, which doesn't always go together, as you can imagine. But yeah, we're really excited to have you here.
Really far, but post-COVID is going to be harder.
Yeah.
Well, and you're not a principal anymore, so this is one of your first years, and maybe your second year where you haven't had to start school. So that must be interesting. Yeah, that's really cool. So, one of the things that I wanted to talk with you about, Leroy, was, we're in a time where there's an increased level of awareness about bias and the race issues that we have in the United States. And there's an increased level of backlash to that. And even just this week, I was saying to Susan before we came on, last 2 weeks, the president has been trying to pull back on funding and support for programming that would increase everyone's awareness about race and equity and the impact of our history of slavery and bias policies, especially on African Americans in this country. So I'm excited to talk to you within that backdrop, because I think that education in schools is one of the most important places where we can start to shift that narrative in our country and start to change how people are. So it's apropos that we're having this conversation on September 11th. during this time in the country when actually having access to more information about individuals' experiences and how bias is showing up is being at least actively suppressed by some. So I'm really glad that you're here and willing to talk with us about that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, like you and I, before we got on the show, we were saying that, you went from being a student to jumping into the classroom. And I just had wondering, and last time we spoke with one of my students who we talked with her about her experience as a student, but then we talked about her experiences in the classroom. I'm just wondering about how your orientation as African-American man, but then teaching in high needs schools, like how did that show up for you, or what were the dynamics that you were experiencing when you went into the classroom?
Yeah, no, there's a funny story about that. It goes back quite a while. So my mom is from Honduras, and my dad's from Boston. My mom is Afro-Latina, and but more particularly, she's Garifuna. And Spanish is her second language. Garifuna is her first, but there's the two big Garifuna communities. One's in the coast of Guatemala and Honduras, right? And there's Garifuna folks there. And then the other place is in the Bronx, New York, which would not have happened, right? So my family was all from the Bronx. We would go to the Bronx and visit my cousins in the high rise. And I remember as a kid, we would walk them to school. Sometimes, like if I was there and they had school and I had a vacation or a break, and I remember looking at their school and just thinking about how much it looked like a jail. And I remember asking that explicitly. I was like, man, you go to jail, you go to school in jail? Because it was like all bars. And just always kept that. And I remember later on, I was just not to drag the story on too much, but my mom made a lot of sacrifices so that I was able to go to school in a place that was very diverse and had white folks in it. It was pretty diverse, right? And it was, so in that sense, we had a lot more privilege coming from that school. There were just more resources, more. So my cousins eventually moved over to stay with us and went to school with us after a while. So I graduated to answer your question, I graduated from college, and I was a part of Teach for America. And we had our summer training in the Bronx. And I was at PS1. That's where I did my training. And it turned out, so I took a picture and sent it to my cousin. And I was like, hey, I'm in the Bronx. I'm in PS1. Like, when you couldn't, like, I'm like, where was your school? And she's like, that was our school. It was PS2.
Ah.
And it was the same building, still looked like a jail. Doesn't look like anything had changed. And I remember having, my class was just all students who I was like, you guys are all African-American kids. Like, it was tough. Like, it was a tough class. And, but I was like, I was like, I understand to some degree what you're going through. Like, I could relate. And I felt like I was leaning on that a lot more, of being able to relate to them, talking to their families, being around. And I remember, as I was like, okay, this is PS1. This is where my cousin went to. I was outside and I overheard someone start speaking in Garifuna, of all the languages. And I was like, so I go over, and I don't know Garifuna myself. That was something that my mom kept secret so she could, talk about me when I was a kid. And, but anyways, so we, I started talking to the folks, and they're like, yeah, we're Garifuna. All of a sudden I was like, and it's just like scales came off of my eyes or something. Like, I was like, oh my, all these kids are Afro-Latinos. They're all Garifuna or Dominican. And there was something about that where I was like, I understand what you're going through in a deeper level than maybe even an American who was Black would understand, because it was like, you had that sort of like this multiple layers, right? Of like being Garifuna, but then being Afro-Latino, but then being in America and trying to navigate the Bronx, right? So having known that, I was able to develop some pretty deep connections with the parents there, and also with the kids in a short amount of time. And I think that level of trust and understanding really made it possible for me to have more difficult conversations with folks, right? About like some difficult, some more, sensitive issues, but then also, I just felt like I could relate, and I could like tell the kids and be like, I was that kid in your seat, And you guys, and in some ways, they're more fortunate because they actually had a community of folks who were experiencing it, where I didn't necessarily have that. So.
Yeah, I appreciate you naming that, and just the power of, it comes up a lot in conversations around the power of sharing identity. And we can't share, you have a very unique identity that's like, it's amazing that matched to such an incredible level, and like, especially your beginning year teaching. But often we don't, right? So we don't often have that moment, but I love that you said like that the scales came off your eyes, that there was like this deeper level of knowing. And I'm just wondering how you're teaching, or you said you could connect with the kids more, but how did your approach to your students change once you made that connection? And is that something that can be, in your opinion, like, if that's not shared, how do you also develop that connection, or how can you start to develop that connection if you don't have that shared background? So I guess it's a two-parter.
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, we're sort of screwed if we can't, right? Because we're never over.
Yeah.
I mean, like if that's like the prerequisite, then there's no way, because it's like everyone's so different, right? And even then, I had to, I felt like an affinity with the group of kids that we were working with. But I was also I went to college. I had a level of privilege that they did not have. Not to say I grew up with any amount of wealth or resources at all. Like, we were very, 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 very poor growing up. But I did go to college, and I did have that experience. And so I was always sort of checking myself. I think that's the key thing for me, is like, how do we continue to check ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Like, and the thing is like, as much as, like you just said it, like, there couldn't be any more boxes checked than I had with the kids I was working with. Like, it couldn't be like, honestly, I am pretty sure that was related to some of these kids. Barely check all of those boxes. And because like I still had to check myself and be like, there's something, like, my experience made it so that I'm like, I just need to know that I'm never ever gonna be who you are sitting in that seat at that moment. So with that being said, I think that one thing that I carried with me when I became a principal, at my school, over 90% of our teaching staff is white, right? Like, white female. Many who come from privilege, right? Not just white privilege, but went to college. Everyone went to college. Everyone had a roof over their head, right? Those are things that some of our kids didn't have. And there was constantly a call for us to have teachers who they're like, you need to get teachers from our community. They have to be Latino, because we're super Latino kids, right? Like, we need to make sure that all of this is lined up. But then I was like, yeah, it's true. And we're going to make every attempt to do this. And like, we need to know that we have allies, right? And we need to be able to trust in those allies. And we need to be able to like have a level of understanding, right? As folks develop into their, exploring their own biases that they're sort of bringing into the classroom. Because, and I think that was actually the biggest thing that we did at our school, was that, while I think other folks would really, look at the resume and try to see how many years you have in teaching, and try to see, we just really dove into like our core values. We're like, are you down? Like, what's your racial lens? Like, what do you think about equity? Why are you actually coming to this work? And then, thinking of like, are you learning? Because we could teach you how to teach kids to read. That part's easy. Like, but are you willing to like do some deep self-exploration and bring that into the classroom? So that was
There's a couple of things that are coming. I mean, it's interesting what you're talking about, and one of it's bringing to mind some of the things and questions I've been asking myself lately about my own lens and the own perception that I have, and that we have as a culture, I think, around what makes a good school and how we're making those choices, right? And as a parent in Oakland, I had to make a choice around which school I'm going to send my child to, and as an educator, where we're working, and sort of thinking about how we're defining what lens we're coming at it from. And at that point around, we need educators who can meet with the kids, who can connect with the kids, who are willing to learn, who are willing to check in with their own bias, is so important. And then really, what are we holding around what it means to be in a school that's primarily Black and brown? Do we believe that those kids can learn in the same way as if there were white kids in the building? And so often I feel like in education, we've defined good schools by how many white kids are in the building. And this is like, how do we check that? How do we start to check that question? And I'm curious because your school was primarily Black and brown, and that question of that they have the capacity to learn was never a question. It seems like you raised the bar for them academically and continued to reach for that. How do you overcome those biases that people hold around, well, it can't be a good school because there aren't white kids here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I was like, I had to take a deep sigh. I was like, oh.
Mm-hmm.
No, you know what? Like, I think there's so much in there. There is, I want to say first is that I think, because I was thinking about what I shared, right? And about the allyship, and like we would look for the racial consciousness of folks, right? And their willingness to learn. But I think our definition too was that, like, I mean, and I think, and I took this from just my experience with Black families, Latino families, is that like we're sending our kids to school so they could learn.
Mm-hmm.
Like my mom taught me everything I need to know about being Black and Latino. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I know that there's some kids who don't have that experience, but at the end of the day, my mom's like, you know, what I can't do is I can't get you to learn and like read and to be ready for, you know, like we were dependent on the teachers to do that. Mm. And I think, you know, and I think like a pedagogical tool for me was really having like an ethic of caring, which is like, we love you. I'm going to work to understand. I'm going to do my own internal exploration so that like my biases aren't impacting you, all in the name of this goal of getting you prepared to be, you know, to have the opportunity to go to college if you want to do that, right? Like, I'm going to make sure that we're not giving up on you, and I'm going to try to check all my biases so I'm not discounting you as an individual. And I think that's what we meant by equity. Is like you need to know that our kids could do it. And if you believe in that, and you're not going to sit there when, you know, one of our students is having a hard time and is like refusing to do the work, you're not going to say like, well, I did everything I can, it's on the kid, you know, or it's on the parent, or they come from this neighborhood, or like we were never we left. This is interesting, stepping away from the school, because a big reason I stepped away was because I felt like we hit a wall. I was like, we're at, you know, 40%. 40% of our kids were at grade level. And I was like, I'm failing 60% of our kids right now. So we need someone else in here who could like get us past this and move us forward. So that's, so even at 40%, I was like, that's not good enough. Like, I don't, you know, we need, and I think that's sort of where I wanted our teachers to come with their equity lens, was to be able to like, be really upset that we're at 40%. And to hold me accountable, right? Because we're at 40%, to say like, what are we doing different? Like, what do we need to do to change and to increase, and provide more opportunities for our kids? So I think that's a big thing for me. Yeah.
One thing you just said that you said a couple of times that to me feels like it's the crux of this work. So I appreciate you naming like, right, you know, like it's not checking me too, because I was like the reminder that actually it's not my job as an educator to teach, you know, an African-American kid what it is to be African-American. It's my job to teach them history or whatever it is. So I feel like that's a helpful lens to have. But the other thing that you were saying about teachers and just the culture at your school is that willingness to look at yourself and to check yourself, and to constantly have that conversation coming forward, which I agree. I mean, I think it's something I've said a lot. Like, I think we always need to have more diversity in our teaching workforce, because that's important. And having people that look like you and that you can relate to and look up to is important. And a lot of people can't, you know, because I think you can miss something, you know, like you can catch something that you don't catch if you don't share that background or their experience. Yeah. And we have primarily white women in education. And, you know, my thing is like, let's just train them then. Like, let's train anybody, but like, we need to train educators to have this level of curiosity and the self-reflection. And we need to hold each other accountable. And I'm just wondering how you do that, because I think that's the tricky part, right? Like, how do you, so I hear that you're hiring for it, which is important, but like, what do you do as a school leader and what do you facilitate in your school to create a culture where there's that introspection, but also that holding ourselves accountable when we slip, because we're going to,
Right.
anyone.
Like the safety and vulnerability. How do you create spaces so those two things?
Yeah, I know. There was this thing that I would always say to my leadership team was like at Acorn Woodland, I was like, I really want this to be a place that's really difficult to fail. And I was like, it's difficult to fail because we have all the systems and structures there to catch people. We have a safety net and we're a community and we're going to help you. But also, like, if you fail and you had that security net, there's like we're going to hold you accountable, right? We're going to actually like the community is going to hold you accountable. And I think that combination of support and expectations, high expectations, was really key because it required the entire community. So the thing is like we need to like we're talking about teacher professional development, teacher learning. And I was like, that's just one piece of it. As a teachers, like we need like a learning community. Like this whole school should be just a learning, like you go to church, everyone in the church is all about church. You went there, like you're right. Everyone's there. Like no one's there like, nah, I'm just here to like paint this wall or whatever, like every Sunday, or, I'm here to sell this stuff. Like no, people are there for church. And I'm like, we're at a school. This is a really special site and a sacred space. We're all here to learn. So parents come on campus and like, you're going to learn. Teachers come on campus, you're going to learn. If you're working in the cafeteria, everyone's going to learn. I was like, we're all going to learn. We're going to be a process of learning. And, one thing that we did put into place when I first got there was we adopted a curriculum that was called Welcoming Schools, and it was about building an inclusive community. And I felt that it was really important that we address that. When I was hired on, one of the big selling points of having me come on, because I was really young, realizing how young I was 29.
Wow.
So when I was 29, I'm coming in and they're like, why are we getting this 29-year-old? What does he know? And in the community, there was some real strife between our Black and brown parents and families. And they're like, this is our person. I was going to say savior, but I don't know if they even said that far. It was like, he's Black, he's Latino. What more do we need? Like, discuss. And I was like, I don't know. Like, I'm like, I don't know if that's going to do it by itself. Like, so the first year at the school, I really just sort of watched and observed and talked to people, interviewed. It really was like interviewing, talked to folks, tried to understand what's happening. And one thing that I saw was there was a ton of racial tension, for sure. There's a ton of investment. We had people on the staff. We had 2 family coordinators. We had family counselors. We had all kinds of resources going into helping to sort of solve the racial tension at the school. And while we were talking about this, right, every day we're talking about our Black and brown students and the families and what do we do. I was noticing, I was like, whoa, like I'm hearing a lot of like homophobic talk in the hallways. I'm hearing a lot of like, you're gay out in the yard. I'm hearing families say this. Like, I'm like, my teachers, I know we have teachers who identify as LGBTQ, but like haven't come out of the closet, and haven't come out to the community, and they don't have like everyone has pictures of their families and their partners are like nowhere to be seen. And I was like, so this is like not a safe space. And it brought me back to just sort of like this Paulo Freire sort of, thought around like, the pedagogy of the press type of cycle. Like you're always going to sort of be in this place if you continue this process of ism or othering, right? Like at some point you need to break that cycle. And even though you may be subjugated at one point, if you ever come into power or you have experience in power in like a certain area, like then you're now the oppressor. You're now, taking the position of the colonial colonizer, right? So I think for me, I really had this approach. I wanted to take this approach of like, we're going to address racism and bias at our school by addressing all the isms. And I was like, we're going to address everything. Like if we're going to say we're going to be racially inclusive, then that doesn't mean anything to me if we're not inclusive of everyone. And we understand that like at the base of that is fear and hatred, really, right? And I was like, we're going to raise kids here, or we're going to support kids and develop kids who are growing up to be anti-racist and anti-homophobic and like anti-disability, like everything. I was like, we need I was like, that's the ideal. is that our kids are growing up without any hate or fear, right? And then that's going to support them as they move on. And that's going to create this really loving community that that I feel like we were able to develop. But the first step was, I think folks in schools think of it from like a real technical approach, right? They don't see it as an adaptive challenge. So they want to bring in a curriculum first. And it's like, we're going to bring in, whatever curriculum, we're going to do this, this thing. And now we have a period, we're going to do 30 minutes of this curriculum. And now we're going to solve all the hatred in the world because we did 30 minutes of this with our kids.
Right.
And I was like, that's not it. So we actually started with the teachers and we started unpacking our own issues. And I was like, this is Oakland, right? So like, we're really good at talking about race. Like, and people have all the language. So you can talk about race. I was like, let's talk about our queer families and our queer staff and like the fact that we have queer kids at our school that, probably haven't like, feel comfortable coming out. And so we use that as like just sort of like an on-ramp to having conversations. And what we realized was that there's a lot of people on our staff who had, I'll just say like homophobic beliefs and tendencies that they were holding on to. And I was like, well, then we can't even let's address this because this is like something that we need to break through and it's gonna be a lot more challenging. And so we started our work there. We brought in a consultant who was skilled in this area and helped to sort of support the dialogue with our teachers. And once we started getting that going, then we brought it to the parents. And in the Latino community, an African-American community, I know this because I grew up in an African-American Latino home. Like you don't talk about LGBTQ. Like that's something, we have gay folks in our family and it's never been discussed, right? Because it's taboo. So I started bringing it up to our African-American Latino families, and that was, we had some really tough conversations and we had some really powerful meetings where folks left crying. And what we did is for both of them is that we had to like tap into everyone's own experience of being othered, right? Like, how do you feel as a Latino person around immigration issues, right? Around like language issues, around like being right in these things that society sort of said others you for, and then same thing with our Black community, right? And then we took that and pulled that from folks, right? And with our, our staff, we talked about gender, we talked about race because people feel really passionate about race. And then we're like, okay, now let's talk about sexual orientation. How does this translate? Like, what are those similarities? So it's really exploring yourself, exploring the fact that others have are experiencing subjugation too and discrimination. And then we're like, okay, now we got like, that took a year to do. And then finally we got to a point where we're like, okay, now how do we take action? And it's like, we're going to adopt this curriculum. We're going to support our kids in this. This is our new like value, right? And this is something that we're all going to believe in and commit to. So we did that. And it was just amazing. Like, whatever, I'll fast forward 10 years later, our kids were on the yard. And you never hear any of the homophobic words. You never hear, any of those things. But more importantly, like the kids were like, we can't other anyone. And once they saw it and they realized that like, even a kid who was bullying someone, there's compassion towards that kid because they're like, we're not going to other you because you're othering. So like, this is how this all starts. So we need to help you. So we had student leaders out there supporting and helping those kids who were sort of instigating fights really explore for themselves, right? And in the classrooms, we supported with the curriculum. Our teachers were coming in and understanding what we were doing. We used the language of allyship. We used the language of like making sure we're not othering. And we made sure kids knew that like, if they were bystanders and they saw something happening on a campus, that they had to stand up for those kids, right? And for those people. And two of my favorite stories that came out of this is, one was we had a teacher who was gay, and a new student was like, I guess, talking about this teacher on, it's the new age. So they were talking about him on like TikTok or something that I don't know, some sort of social media thing, because I'm too old now. And 29-year-old principal, I would have been there, but not anymore. And the kids dealt with it on their own online. And we're just like, no, like we don't do that here. Like, and defended that teacher. And he found out because the kids sort of showed them the post and were like, and he was like, they had my back. Like they were just like, they didn't even bring it to the office. They didn't bring it to me and be like, they didn't have to, because they're like, no, we don't stand for this. The other is a parent who, very similarly, a new parent came in and was upset because they found out that one of the teachers was gay and talked about his partner. And I was like getting ready to say something during this coffee chat, but I didn't have to, because another parent who's gone through the training stood up and was like, this is our community. If you don't appreciate these values, then you maybe need to look at another school, because here, this is not where we do that. And other parents all joined in. So I think like what we were able to do with that is that I think we were able to take that, and now those are two specific around just sexual orientation, but we were able to take that and apply it to race. And then anytime we had racial conversations, racial issues, it was the same thing, the same topic, same way of addressing it. And then, we adopted a full inclusion SPED model at our school. So our kids were all integrated into the classrooms, and we saw some really great results from having that structure for those kids and for those families. And really what I think was key to that was the loving, caring community that the kids sort of created for the students who were coming in that had IEPs. Because they were like, okay, like, some of the kids were, on the spectrum, and some of them were nonverbal. The kids were like, they weren't like, we're going to make fun of you because you're different. They're like, no, like, we get it. We know that, like, we're going to be allies for you, and we're going to support you. And if anyone comes and makes fun of you, then we're not going to be here as bystanders. So those were, so it was really great to have our classrooms be integrated, because it was like, okay, we can really practice, our kids are really practicing this, like, on all levels, right? So anyway,
I'm curious. I mean, I love this story. I love the way in which you used intersectionality to address and sort of bring it to the othering as the core value to dismantle. And I'm curious because watching teachers in their classroom, when you have control, like I've seen lots of teachers in your room, and you have control over your relationships and the way you set up your culture and conditions for learning. And then it seems like you were able to move to principal position and in your leadership, be able to take some of those core values which you had in your classroom and translate them into a full school community that really embodied those, understanding that it takes actually a really long time, and that you have to meet people where they're at, and that you kind of keep chipping away at it through a really thoughtful process, understanding the social emotional needs of folks to be able to get to where they're getting. And now that you're on more of a policy level, or more on a, like district level, and that we know you're running for school board as well, and sort of thinking about taking these ideas to the school board, how do you translate as you move into these, each further away from the kids in some ways, to the greater systemic ways in which you might try and bring these values and beliefs and core practices that have resulted in an inclusive community where across the board inclusive? How do you bring that to like a district level?
Mm-hmm. So here's, I love that question. Because I get a lot of this. Folks are like, okay, great. You're a strong teacher. And then now you're going to try to bring a principal. It's totally different. Become a principal, and it's like, okay, I'm successful. And you're a successful principal, and now you're trying to become a school board member. I'm like, well, it's like it's a similar shift. Like, I think that actually, it's always been sort of boggling to me how few educators are on school boards.
I know.
Like, I never knew. I don't know if the community even knows that. Like, that most school board members aren't educators by training. That's not to say that you have to be, but it is saying, like, it's just an interesting trend how common that is. And I think that for me to say that my years teaching did not help me as a principal would be ridiculous. Like, that was like, I leaned on that all the time. I couldn't imagine being a principal and never being a teacher. So I feel like similar to that is like this concept around policy, is that they're like, good policy is interesting to me, because I think good policy isn't necessarily like, well, let me just be real. I think often what we do with policy is that we figure out what people like and what's going to get people elected, right? So you put out policies that are just going to get you elected, and then you're not really thinking about like what's the impact, how is this going to like play out. And I think in Oakland we have a ton of policies, and as a principal who's supposed to enact these policies, like I couldn't tell you any of them until I started running for school board, right? I was like, I don't know what's going on. All I know is these kids got to read. So I'm just going to make them read, right? All I know is that my teachers need PD on Wednesdays. So we're going to figure that out. So like the policies were, for me, every policy was bad because none of them were actually impacting classrooms. I don't care how great the policy is on paper or how many votes you could get on it. Based off of that, if it's not like impacting kid learning and it's not impacting the classroom and it's not making life different for our Black and brown kids, then it's not a good policy. It doesn't make any sense. And right now we don't really have many good policies. So I think that that's where my, the expertise that I do have of being a teacher, being a principal comes in, is that like I could sit there and, I could have a seat at the table and be able to say what's going to be crap policy. And it's just about people just sort of getting themselves, elected or what have you. And then what's going to be good policy and actually impact classrooms. And I know it's not as simple as that, as a really simplistic term, like the way of putting it, I guess, but that's the way I see it. And I think that's the way most people who are voting in our, like, they're relying on the school board to be able to have that approach of thinking about how is this actually going to be enacted? How is this actually going to and being able to measure that, right? Like we don't, like a lot of things, we don't even know if it's working. So we don't even know if it's good policy. So.
Yeah, I appreciate you naming that, Leroy. And actually I want to go back on, because you kind of alluded to something I was going to call out, which is, when you, to me, it feels like important just to call out this critical shift that you made to othering. So you allowed everyone to be able to connect to what it feels like to be an other. And that automatically developed empathy for everyone and their capacity then to relate to someone even across difference, which I think is a really powerful step. And often I think sometimes is missing when we have conversations about race or identity is we do kind of other each other. And then it's really hard to connect in because then you feel automatically like on the outside and uncomfortable. So I just want to say that felt really important. The other thing you did, I'm going to get it to like the policy question, but is at your school, you took time, which I think often is the thing that we miss when we start doing equity work is like, and it's what I'm nervous about right now in this moment in time. Like suddenly everyone's like, yeah, Black Lives Matter. And, I'm going to put the poster up in my house or whatever. But like, actually, but you have to do something behind that, right? Like it's cool to do that. But if that's all you're doing, you're not actually like doing the inner work or being curious. That's not going to make a big change, I don't think, in most people's lives or actually in your own internal experience of people. And that's what's more important, right? Is like really actually checking yourself more. So what you did though, is you took a long time to build that capacity for everyone. So it wasn't like, so I go to that example because I'm like, you turn on Netflix and there's like a banner. And for me, I'm like, okay, great. I'm glad that it's on everyone's awareness, but like, what are we going to do to actually change the programming that's here? That's going to change how people understand people that are different than ourselves, or what are we going to change around our policies to make sure that they're more supportive, because what you did is you took it and you took time, because schools will often do like one quick PD, like okay, well, equity is important, we're gonna jump right into the boiling water here and like have everybody expose themselves and have this big conversation, and actually didn't do that under the green line work or the more nuanced work, which is building relationships, setting expectations, naming the tone of your community, and then taking time. The fact that you took a year to engage with the adults and get the adults, both parents and staff, clear before implementing a policy, I just think is such a powerful shift, because then everybody could hold it. And then, yeah, it's beautiful because then you can step back and everyone's holding each other in check because you've invested in their time and their energy to be able to do that work from the beginning. And I don't say like, I'm glad there's Black Lives Matter signs up everywhere. I'm not trying to be snarky about that, but like there is this presentation level that can show up with that, but not the changing the behavior level, which is where I'm impatient to get to. So when you think about being a board member then, and I agree with you as somebody who's running for school board as well, like and actually my street cred as a district person and my experiences isn't weighed as heavily as a lot of other things in the community that I'm running in, which I think is really interesting. Like, you're right, that trend is so real that like actually having lived experience, knowing what it's going to feel like for a teacher to deal with our policies, or a school leader to deal with our policies. We don't have folks that are doing that very often that are running for school board. And I do think it's important. So when you imagine like addressing equity, and Oakland does talk about equity a lot, but we also have a lot of issues around equity, and we have these huge disparities. So if you take that experience from Acorn Woodland, and again, like that building time, how do you imagine like taking something that, you know, maybe it's even just one of the things you did at your school, how would you want to take that to a larger level in a policy? Sorry, those are really long build-ups.
No. I mean, yeah, I know, it's interesting because I was thinking, you know, I think there's like two things that sort of come to mind, and they're not, and then I'll bring it back to the policy piece, right? Like, it's one is vulnerability, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think that folks just aren't vulnerable. You know, I watch the school board meetings, I sit in some of the district meetings, and I think folks are really like on guard.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're on guard, then you're automatically, there's an other.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So like, you're automatically like villainizing, there's some sort of threat, you're villainizing, like you're not going to be able to do your best work, right? And bringing the community together. And I think vulnerability and transparency are like two of the things that build trust. And I think what's really difficult what's the biggest challenge for Oakland right now, and has been as long as I've been here, maybe even longer, is that there's a real trust issue.
Mm-hmm.
There's like, I mean, it feels really, you know, I'm jumping into essentially the fire, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
going into politics and going into the school board, because, you know, we're coming off of last year, you know, fights happening at the school board meeting. Every time I've gone, there's been really like just a lot of shouting and a lot of sort of hate language, essentially, right? And the thing is like, I'm like, it's tough as an educator because like education just brings me so much joy. Like, it's just such a beautiful thing. You get to be with kids, you get to be with educators, you get to be with the most amazing people. And it's like, and you're supposed to create this loving, beloved community, but then around it is this like this circling of just like hate and othering and people just going at each other. I say all that because it means that people don't have, there's a lack of trust. And I think that lack of trust comes from people not being vulnerable and a lack of transparency. And we really need to be able to get to a place where we're having explicit conversations about what's what. And I think that we've been stuck. I've been just, I mean, flabbergasted by the politics involved. And I think that there's like, I mean, I share this with my friends too, who are not here, but you know, they'll read stuff that's out there. And I think that there's folks who are like Leroy's like Mr. Charter. And I was like, man, I worked in public school my entire life. The last 20 how am I approaching? Like, what are you talking about? My entire life has been dedicated to improving Oakland public schools, like OUSD. So it's just like, so it's just like, man, how does that work? Like, and then, you know, so I think like like people will come and attack you and they're going to try to other you. And then it's like, no, I've actually like I'm doing this for the people who are out there trying to other me and their kids, and like for the community. Like, this is why we're doing this. And it's going to be like, so, I mean, I don't come with any real, I like to say I don't have much of an ego, but who knows, right? I'm always exploring that for myself, but I feel like I'm a person who I'm just like, if you come at me, I'm just going to have the same sort of disposition. And I'm going to try to understand why you're coming at me and explore it and see if there's any bias that I'm bringing that's like causing that. And then, so I think I think I was really fortunate being at Acorn Woodland because we had a lot of teachers who were very similar, and we were just always just in the place where like, let's have transparency, let's have faith in each other, and you know what, like, and let's be vulnerable with each other. And we really were able to do that and create a really nice place so that the kids were able to do that and the parents were able to do that, and we just had straight conversations. So I think if I'm able to do anything in the time and the board is one, to get our board to be in a place where they're a little bit more vulnerable, right? And get our district in a place where we're being a little more vulnerable and being more transparent, and also just the community in general. Like, we have a responsibility to the community, but the community has a responsibility as well, right? So how are we all sort of supporting each other and making this better, because we're at a critical place. Another thing I would say is that I think this is this, it's, it seems pretty apocalyptic coming off of like the Mars, like the sun didn't come up. The sun literally didn't come up the other day.
Yeah, it was so strange.
So we're in this place where, high anxiety, and there's not much to be hopeful for. But I think that in this process, it's really bringing the community to a place where we're just like, we're not certain about the things that we were certain about before, right? So I think folks are questioning it, and literally are very vulnerable, right? They're like, we don't know anymore. Like, we thought the sun comes up every day. It didn't come up yesterday. Like, what does this mean? Right? And I think people are exploring their own racial bias too, like white folks are in the city, in a way that they haven't in the past. Like, we're going beyond just the hype and all the, I'm being woke and all this stuff, like to actually being like this is a lot. Like, Black folks we've been believing Black Lives Matters, for us. My mom's been telling me to watch out for, when I was a kid, she would like slap my hand if I tried to like wave at a police officer, because she's like, no, this is not a safe place for a Black man to be in. Like, that's not, and so we all know that. But our white community, starting to actually understand a little bit more and wanting to learn a little bit more and wanting to be more of a positive, like, we need to take advantage of that. And I think a big part of that is, like, as a school district, we need to start really having a conversation around, like, what is the experience for Black kids in schools? Why are they having that experience, right? Like, I think I would say the defund the police stuff is like, I'm like, yeah, I mean, we were at school, like, we weren't using police officers. We had more therapists we had 2 counselors on our campus, and we were trying to get kids as much service from that as possible. That's not to say that we didn't have good relationships with OUSD PD, but it is to say, like, that was our first approach, was to go through mental health. And so I think that's an interesting movement that we need to really continue to explore and figure out how do we get that. But I do think that we are also in a place where we need to start thinking about like not every Black kid is suffering and not learning in Oakland because like there's police in schools. There's a lot that's involved why our kids aren't doing well in the schools, and we need to explore that and be transparent and be explicit about what that is. And we're never going to be able to solve unless we're able to face that, our own internal demons in education. So
it really brings up, I mean, I've been having these conversations about radical reimagination, reimagining in the moment that we're in right now. Like, we are in a moment, and I think so much of what has been there is now becoming so evident to people who haven't seen it before, which is kind of what you're talking about. It's like, you can't ignore it anymore. It's always been there, but the ability to like not see it or not look at it is diminished. And so we have this opportunity for radical reimagination. And I find myself going through like a roller coaster of hope and despair during this time, and hope of like, okay, we're really going to make some real change that will affect in real ways the experience that kids have in our schools. And then I'll be in rooms with conversations where the same kind of broken communication happens again, or the same kind of siloed thinking and lack of vulnerability, I think, which is what you brought up. And as someone who's been in education for 20 years, but never been a teacher, never been an administrator, right? I'm on the mental health end of things, on the trauma end of things. When you talked about most of the board members haven't been educators, so I just sort of think about like how much language I had to learn as a non-teacher educator to be able to like communicate. So now I think in education language, but when I started as a mental health clinician in the schools, I had to like translate my community, it was almost like translation. And I wonder if you have a school board who's making decisions, who's not vulnerable, who's not, not really able to take that hard experience and speaks a different language and is making policy decisions for our kids, I think it makes sense that we haven't been able to dig into that disproportionality that just even when we decrease suspensions or decrease expulsions or increase academic scores, like all those things are great, but we have not been able to make a single dent in disproportionality. And so I feel like I wonder about that. Is it because our school board is made up of folks that, I don't know. I mean, what is that radical reimagining that we need to do in order to get deeper?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had the answer to that. Maybe.
Yeah, that's a tough question.
Yeah, you don't have I feel like I put you on the spot, Leroy. I'm sorry. I'm like, I don't know what the answer is either. And I guess what I'm wondering is like, how do we at least open up the space for we can't imagine because we have to create the space for reimagining. And so it's what I'm hoping for. It's like, how do we create those spaces? It sounds like you did that in your leadership, giving the time, giving the space, creating the safety, creating the conditions for adults to be able to shift their practice and do the hard work of looking at themselves. And we're in this moment that I feel like more of it is happening, and how do we capitalize on it, I guess.
It's like people are, I'm going to answer the question because I want to answer it. Do you mind, Leroy? I want to jump in because I heard you say something. I'll take you off the hook. I mean, I think this is actually what I want to spend like all my time talking about is like, how do we reimagine education? Because I think actually a lot of what we've built doesn't work anymore. And Absolutely. We are in this place where we can do something different. But something that you said that, and maybe I keep hearing it because it's a value I have as well. And wrote a book about it, is like actually the self-awareness and this willingness to look at yourself and be vulnerable and to name when I made a mistake or to check my own privilege or to let down my guard is such a powerful piece of it. And, you said something that for me really was validating. I mean, it's not a big surprise, but I spent, 15 years in the central office that you've visited and, been in and around and the guards are up and people are really, I love that concept of othering. They're othering each other all over the place. And I do it too all day, right? You have to just check yourself constantly of like, oh shoot, am I judging other people? Am I, and continuing to be questioning our own selves and be willing to be vulnerable and acknowledge when we make a mistake or when we made a misstep, or acknowledge that there's a bias there that we need to look at. So I think there is as a board member, there is an opportunity for vulnerability that can be helpful. And I don't know what the conversations are like for you as you're having, I imagine you're having a parallel experience to me where you're being called into like panel interviews with other panelists and things like that are public. But one of the things that I chose to do in the school board race that I'm in is to really stay curious and open and actually applaud the excellent work of the other people that are running. And it's really shifted my energy towards them. And I could feel myself in the beginning being like, well, I want to prove that I know more and I'm going to, I want to show, I want to win. And I stopped like orienting around that pretty early on. And it's been more around like, well, let's just call it the qualities that feel important. So my whole focus when I'm in these school board conversations is to call it the qualities and the ideas that I feel are most important for us as a district to be tackling, whether or not they're mine. So if it came from someone else, I'm like, cool, that was a really great idea. And that's what we need. And I want to reinforce that. And what's neat is, and I'm not saying I did it, but I think the other people that I'm running with, a lot of them had the same value. And so this morning, even one of my competitors, so to speak, like defended another one, like there's 6 of us running and one of them was getting kind of called out and another one jumped in and defended her and was like, we're not going to do that. This isn't how we're running this thing here.
That's powerful. That's really amazing. Cause I know that was not the culture. That's a big culture shift. And it sounds similar to some of the things Leroy did.
Yeah. And maybe it's just like all of us as humans in this time are seeing it. Maybe it's because we've been seeing how much this othering looks like and how damaging it is on like when you have a president that's doing the othering, what happens then. But I just want to say that I think that's such a powerful part of the shift that I'm excited for you to bring to the Oakland School Board is, that connection and the honoring of individuals, and it's not like a competition like that.
I think that's it. I took a pretty big pay cut so I could run for school board, and I loved my job, and but I felt like I had to jump in because I love Oakland. I was just like, I want to be here. I want to, be a part of the solution. And I think what you said really, really resonated with me, because one of the big ahas for me is just sort of how cutthroat this is, like the races. So like the fact that that should be the norm, right? Like if you see someone getting called out and you're like, no, that's not right. You should be okay. But then we have our teams of people who are advising us, and folks are going to say like, like put your mean face on. You got to like, especially with me, because I don't have a very good mean face. So wear a costume to get a little tougher. And I'm like, this is not, sometimes there's a competitor who's with us, and you would think, we sit on very different sides of how do we think the solution for Oakland should be, what it should be, how we can go about it. And there's days where I'm, like I've heard them say some stuff, and I'm like, actually, yeah, we agree on that. Like, that's a great point. There's a lot of things I don't agree with, but I'm like, and I think it's just like how much politics are involved. It's like you sort of have to sit in your corner. It is competitive, right? It feels like, I played college football. It feels very similar to college football, where you're sitting there, you used to watch videotapes and like train, like, you're like, oh, here I should have said this. I should have said this. But like, I think it's like I wish we could just sort of take that piece out of it. And because you're not going to, the solution for all these issues that we have is like super complex. Like we need all the best thinking and all the creative thoughts out there to come up with a solution for these things. And like, sitting in our sort of idea, like one, I think is the folks we were very privileged to be able to have ideological debates about what should be happening in schools, right? Like the kids and the parents don't have this freedom to do that. And I think that, as we're having it, we're just wasting time. There's kids in classrooms right now, as we speak, literally. They're in like, Zoom meetings or whatever.
Yeah, I was gonna say they're not in class. They're in classes.
So like, and like the times are calling for us to be really innovative and to reimagine what moving forward is. All I know, like to answer that question I had, Susan, is like all I know at this point right now is that we can't go back to what we had.
Right.
Like that's not okay. Like we can't be that. We can't do that. We got to move forward. And I think, absolutely, like, it's going to require us to sort of all sit at the table together in ways that we haven't before, and to be able to suck in our pride and be like, that's a great point. Oh, I like that. Like, let's try that, and be able to admit when we're wrong, because we're going to be wrong. Like
hell, a lot.
All day. I mean, I feel like I was wrong 5 times in this call. So like, it's like, that's the deal, right? Yeah.
That's been my mantra.
Give you
it's been my mantra the whole time since we've gone into shelter in place, of how do we emerge from this better than we came in. And so it's a mess, right? There's so much crisis happening. There's so many hard things that have been happening, but I try and stay grounded every day. And how do we emerge from this better than we came in? And I do think there are some ways that we are, and I think there's a lot more ways that we can. So how do we keep like plugging away at figuring out how to dismantle some of the things that aren't working? So I try and stay grounded there. It's not always easy.
Yeah. So we're just about at time here. But I want to, I'm so excited for your run, and I'm not at all surprised that I want to keep talking to you for another 5 hours about all of this. But
I'm looking forward to both of you being on school boards. Right? Alameda would be very lucky to have you on their school board.
Well, again, like I'm taking the process. That's what I'm focused on right now, rather than the outcomes. That's my angle. But what I wanted to say was, the idea of the vulnerability of building trust, and what I appreciated you naming, you modeled a few times really beautifully, and it's important for me to keep checking myself, is just checking our privilege and being aware of, I try and really take seriously myself in this brace of like, right, I have the privilege of using my voice and of being heard, and that means a lot of people don't have that voice, and there's urgency right now. So I don't know if you have any final thoughts you want to give us, Leroy, as we say goodbye. But I love so much of what you brought forward is so important.
Yeah, no, I mean, like I think as thinking about just my own experience growing up, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, but my mom was homeless when she came here to the States, and like was on the streets in Boston, and then she moved my brothers and sisters over from Honduras later on, and just like there's the thing is, like, we all have a story about like why we're doing this work. Like we all have a trajectory of like why we decided to go into public service, and I think it's I feel like we're failing. Like we're failing Oakland, and we're failing our kids and our families, and it's like, how do we sort of put aside some of the stuff that we're bringing in terms of like I would say like the politics, but like obviously we're in politics, right? But how do we put aside some of those things and be able to make life and make this place a lot better, because we have to. And the thing is like that's what like that's at this sort of city local level, and then at the national level we're seeing how this is impacting, and it's just not good. Like we sit in our corners and things go to shit. So I feel like we need to sort of break down those barriers, break those things down, and just have real conversation. And we're in a really good spot to be able to make that happen. And it's going to be a real honor if I'm on school board. If I'm not, then I hope whoever's there can really fix this for us, because it's it's high stakes. We're talking about the future. So yeah, thanks guys. Thanks so much for having me on.
Leroy.
I mean, we shut off the live.
Class is dismissed. Wasn't that fun? Susan and Megan are always happy to greet you on the next episode of The Awakening Educator. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Education is the foundation for a brighter future. Open your eyes to The Awakening Educator.